Welcome to this online session with the acclaimed novelist and historian Maggie Craig to celebrate the publication of her brand new book, On the Wings of the Storm, which I have got here. This is On the Wings of the Storm. It's the fourth book in the Storm over Scotland series. I'm Dawn Geddes. I'm here today with Maggie to find out more about this exciting book. Hello, Maggie.
Hello, Don.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. All the better for a bit of sunshine.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sun is shining here as well. It makes a lovely change. So thank you so much for joining me today. I wonder if you can tell me if we could go back a little bit and find out a little bit about what brought you to novel writing in the first place.
I think I've always been a writer. In my family, it's quite normal to write. And I bore my younger relatives by telling them that we descend from Robert Tannahill, the Weaver poet of Paisley. And it seems to have come down through the generations. There were people who wrote comic poetry. There have been journalists. My brother Sandy was a freelance journalist. My dad was a railwayman and was very interested in transport, and he wrote articles about transport. So it was just a normal thing to do, which I think is very lucky if you grow up in a family like that. And you said, I'm away to write a poem, and your mother said, "Yeah, okay, that's fine." So it's just something I don't understand why people don't write. It's
Mhm.
such a wonderful way of expressing yourself and getting your emotions out. And also, it means you've got loads of imaginary friends, which is also nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when did you start sort of writing then? When was your first? It was non-fiction first, wasn't it, for you?
It was non-fiction first. My first book was Damn Rebel Bitches, The Women of the 45. And that was back in when we were celebrating, this is showing my age now, in the middle of the 1990s. And everybody was writing articles about Bonnie Prince Charlie because a character like him, the evaluation of him swings like a pendulum. And I thought, why is nobody mentioning the women? And the only woman they seemed to mention was Flora MacDonald. And I already knew that there had been other women involved. So I thought, well, I'll just go and see if there are other women involved. And I found out there was loads of them. And I thought, well, they merit a book on their own. So that's where it started.
Amazing. And so On the Wings of the Storm is the fourth book in the Storm over Scotland series. Can you tell me a little bit about the series and where did the inspiration for it come from?
The inspiration came from a picture of a man in a magazine, and he was kind of quietly handsome, but he looked sad. He looked as though maybe something had gone wrong in his childhood and he wasn't too happy. And I put it up on my paper holder beside my computer and just looked at it for weeks and weeks. And gradually I began to work out who he was because I'm an imaginative writer. I don't like to plan. And suddenly I thought, I'll just sit here and write something. And I found myself in Edinburgh in the 1740s, and this man was captain of the town guard and he was in pursuit of an illegal dissection because, as people will know, it was illegal to have bodies dissected. And the only way you could do this was criminals who were hanged. So many of them were handed over to surgeons.
Mhm.
He was pursuing this, but in reality, he was pursuing somebody who was a Jacobite conspirator. And that Jacobite conspirator turned out to be my heroine's father, who's a professor at the Old College in Edinburgh. And Robert and Christian met, hated each other on sight, classic romantic situation. But things change.
Yeah, amazing. And so you tell us where this sort of latest book picks up then.
Well, the latest book is they were forced to separate because they're absolutely on opposite sides politically, and they can't compromise on that because they both have their feelings and their beliefs that are very strong, but they're also at the mercy of the tides of history, and that's a big theme of the book.
Mhm.
What happens to so-called ordinary people when history intervenes? And another important character is in the book is Duncan Forbes of Culloden, Lord President of the Court of Session. And although he was very anti-Jacobite, and I'm reasonably pro-Jacobite, he's one of my heroes because he didn't want to see Scotland plunged into bloodshed. That was his big thing. So he forced Robert and Christian to part. So Robert had to go back to his regiment on the continent because Britain was fighting wars on the continent. And then Bonnie Prince Charlie lands in Scotland in the Northwest Highlands. And, they think this is a little local difficulty. But Robert sent back, because he's an engineer, so he's sent back to inspect places like Fort William and Fort Augustus to see how strong the defences are. And fate, fate does these things. Fate has them meeting up unexpectedly at Rothiemay House in Banffshire, and that's where this book kicks off. But I have a wee prologue where Prince Charlie is coming from Saint-Nazaire in France on his way to Scotland with his 7 men of Moidart, as they were romantically called. And he comes to Scotland and throws himself on the mercy and the loyalty of the Highlands, and people rally to his standard at Glenfinnan. And that's kind of where we start the book off from.
Brilliant. And you're going to give us a little preview of the book just now and do a little reading, aren't you, Maggie?
Yes, I'm going to do a little reading, which is just right at the very beginning. And Robert, who's riding around Banffshire, to Anne Buchan and Murray, and with letters from the Lord President to influential people to say there's an emergency. We think who they call the Pretender's son has landed in Scotland. So he's turned up at Rothiemay House, and Christian's there because she's visiting friends there. And she and her friend Anna, who's a strong personality in the book. Anna's the friend. I've been lucky enough to have friends like this who poke fun at you, but when you need them, they're there. So this is just a short reading.
Perfect.
She did that pretty damn quickly. Yes, Christian Rankeillor agreed. I'll be surprised if she hasn't smudged her painting. Like Robert Catto, she was watching the rapidly retreating figures of Anna Gordon and her cousin James Duff as they walked away from them over the grass. They were carrying Anna's painting things between them. James had her collapsed easel under one arm, the other threaded through the legs of the stool she'd been sitting on. Anna was carrying her paints box with the canvas she'd been working on tucked inside it. Like Christian's, her box was ingeniously fitted out to shield a still wet painting, but she had placed the protective cover rather hastily over it. Both girls had been working on a depiction of the ancient stone circle, which sat in the field next to Rothiemay House. Until Anna had looked up in response to the sound of approaching male voices and urged Christian to look up too, excitement in her voice, or maybe trepidation. When Christian had seen Robert Catto walking towards her, Robert Catto, whom she had longed for through the dark reaches of so many lonely nights, Robert Catto, who was now standing mere feet away from her. His red uniform was a startling splash of colour against the vibrant green of the grass. Overwhelmed by the sight of him, she reached for a clean corner of the rag in her paint box and dabbed at the spot of colour on her skirts. It had got there when she'd abruptly lowered her brush, stunned and bewildered by his sudden appearance. After they had parted in Edinburgh a year and more ago, she had thought she would never see him again. His eyes ranged over her hand, the brush and rag it held, and her own paints before rising once again to her face. Hello, Miss Practical. She rose to her feet, drawing in a breath at the well-remembered nickname. What are you doing here? Take a wild guess. I'm sure you've heard the rumours. She'd been discussing those with Anna only moments before. The moments that Prince Charles Edward Stuart had landed in the West, bringing with him only a few companions. As French domestic politics had changed course, French interest in supporting the Jacobite cause had waned. So if Charles really had come to Scotland, he'd done so with little more than the hope of Scotland rising in armed rebellion, with the aim of putting his father James back on the British throne. If it had been a huge risk a year before, when the plan had been for him to sail for England with thousands of French troops backing him up, it was even more of one now. "'Tis a rash adventure, to be sure," Robert Catto said, "if the rumours are true." What she had been thinking must have shown on her face. He'd always been able to read her, like an open book. "Are you here to find out if they are?" "You might say that. Gathering intelligence, scouting out the lie of the land, sounding out opinion, inspecting defences. It's what I do." And I'll just leave it there.
Oh, fantastic. It's so vivid, Maggie. You really feel like you're there. I was going to ask you, obviously you are an historian, so what is it particularly about this specific period of history that really fascinates you enough to have written sort of 4 books, 4 novels?
Because I've done a lot of non-fiction research at places all over Britain, there's people in the 18th century wrote screeds of letters, so there's lots of information there, and they come leaping off the page, and they sound like people like us. They say things like, "I thought I would drop you a line to tell you what's happening," and there's another cache of letters which are at the National Archives in London in Kew, Jacobite letters, Jacobite soldiers writing home, and these letters were intercepted by someone, and they're really touching because
Mm.
this is when the Jacobite army had marched into England, and one man's saying to his wife, "Sell the cow, make sure you get a good price for her." Someone else is saying, "If they go by Dumfries, of course, he'll go and visit Aunt Joanne." Someone else said to his girlfriend, "Nothing ails me but the wanting of you." And suddenly you're in this very studious surroundings, these very studious surroundings, and they're just there. They seem to me to be very much people like us, argumentative, quite bawdy in their relationships, laughed a lot. They're just lovely. I love them. But then when it push came to shove, they went out and did what human beings have sadly been doing for thousands of years and went out onto the battlefield
Mm.
and started fighting each other. And I find that incredibly moving that
Mm.
these really intelligent people resorted back to primitive ways of sorting out their problems.
Yeah. And as you say, from the letters and stuff, that really sort of brings those people to life and it really kind of helps that history sort of jump out of the page, doesn't it?
Yes. What I did was I'm terribly attached to these letters. I've got copies of a few of them. And I've brought them into the book because when I wrote Damn Rubber Bitches and its companion volume, Bare Arse Banditi, I mentioned the letters, and I offered the opinion that whoever noted them down, because there's a little booklet that goes with them, and it says letter from so and so to so and so, mentioning if there was anything about manoeuvres, anything of political importance, but there wasn't really. And I had put, I hope the Redcoat officer who detailed these was thoroughly ashamed of himself and at reading other people's love letters. And then I thought, when I was writing the book, I thought, Robert's that officer. My fictional character is that officer because he's strong
Mm.
and he can be violent too, but he's got scruples. He's got moral scruples, and he comes across a letter written by a friend who's a Jacobite, and it's a dilemma for him. But he's a soldier, and he does his duty, so he has to read it. And he takes the letter. He doesn't keep the letter in Edinburgh Castle, where it was then. And he shows it to Christian, and she's horrified, and she says, "You read it? How could you read it? These are our friends." And he says, "But I had to read it. It was my duty to read it." And then
Hmm.
he says to her, "Does this change anything between us?" And she says, sadly, "No, because they're having to cope with the difficulties that history's flung
Yeah.
into their laps."
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it seems quite obvious now from talking to you, but like the sort of the romance and the history together, obviously, it was there, so it kind of reading these sort of letters has obviously kind of, made that kind of connection for you. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why it is important for you to sort of blend those two things together, because I know quite a lot of, sometimes people tend to kind of shy away from kind of that romance sort of element of historical books.
Yes, and I think that's a pity. It
Mm.
goes back to, well, possibly my favourite book after The Flight of the Heron by D.K. Broster is Dr. Zhivago, although I have to cheat. I have read Dr. Zhivago. It's the movie that's my favourite story. It's the idea of two people meeting at absolutely the wrong time and history's doing what history does. So I love that, those dilemmas and how are they going to come through that. I love historical fiction, but I do feel some authors do shy away, and the romance is just, there's a love story, but it's just a bit anemic.
Mm.
And I think it's adds another strand to the story if I love this person, but we've met at the wrong time and in the wrong place. And then you just go out from there and develop that theme.
Yeah, and as you say, I do think the romance element helps us really kind of connect with the characters as well and kind of put yourself in that person's shoes. It kind of makes it more human, doesn't it?
I think so, yes. Uh-huh. Because otherwise people are just very rigid and you think, well, where are these people's emotions?
Hmm. Yeah. And as you're a non-fiction writer as well, but as we've mentioned, and an historian, I just wondered, how does the research for those kind of books that you've written, Damn Revel Bitches, and The Men of 40, sorry, The Bear Arse Bandit, I was obviously trying to avoid saying that, The Men of the 45, how does that sort of impact, that sort of, I think often, when I've interviewed writers before, they'll say, when you're a non-fiction writer, obviously the fact is, absolute. And then when you're a fiction writer, you're able to kind of play around with it a little bit. I wondered how, you found that process, having that sort of historical background.
Um, yes, I think for me, there's a rule. In non-fiction, as you said, facts are king. And you want to amalgamate as many facts as you can and uh, tell them in an interesting and entertaining way, but you've got to be absolutely honest. Then when you come to fiction, you think, oh, well, this person was a really nice person, even though in history he's not regarded as a really nice person. So what do I do about that? So that's a difficulty. My own view is that if you can't change facts, but if there's a gap, you can fill it in. So I think that's what works out.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's quite a few real people in the novel, and I'm attributing conversations to them that they never had because they're having them with another fictional person. But there's a gap, so I can fill it in. And because
Yeah.
I've done so much research, I know what people's attitudes were on different sides of the conflict.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose it's such a brilliant grounding, isn't it, when you come to write something like that, to know these sort of periods of history so well, and not be kind of scared. To know the rules, I suppose, helps you kind of maybe bend them slightly when you're kind of writing something like that.
I wrote a book about the Scottish radicals of 1820, who've rather been forgotten and unfortunately got forgotten again because the bicentenary happened during COVID.
Mm.
So things that were planned didn't plan. But my editor thought I was too novelistic because there was a massacre at Greenock. 8 people were shot and killed by the local militia. And one was an older woman and one was a young boy. And I had a couple of sentences about, you wonder what the atmosphere was in Greenock that evening, where people sitting by their firesides wondering what on earth had happened.
Yeah.
And one editor thought that was too novelistic. And I thought, no, because you're just going out from being a human. And if something shocking happens, you think about it.
Yeah, of course. Of course, yeah. Um, and do you think you'll like what's next? Do you think you'll write more? Is it more novels or will you return to non-fiction?
I've got another non-fiction on the stocks,
Hmm.
and it's mainly done and it's been edited by an excellent editor. And I'm going to do something about that later in the year. It's about George IV's visit to Edinburgh in 1820. And I was inspired by John Preble's The King's Jaunt, but wanted to try and do something different. And of course, nowadays, so much is available to you at the click of a mouse. There's so many documents you can look at online. So that'll be the next one. The Anna, my heroine's friend, Anna and her sweetheart, you have to use the word sweetheart in the 18th century terms. Alec Forbes, he's a gardener and a Jacobite, and he was the one who Robert found his letter. I think Anna and Alec need their story told, so I think that will be coming up next.
Excellent, very exciting. So, thank you so much for that, Maggie. That was absolutely fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating to hear you read and to talk about the stories. And On the Wings of the Storm is out now. Am I right? Yeah, it's out.
It's
It's
out now.
officially
It's out
launched.
now as the ebook, and the paperback will be coming out in the middle of March.
Fantastic. So do go and get yourself a copy. Order your Kindle copy now. It's available now, or you can order your paperback copy for the middle of March.
Thanks
And
very much for having me.
thanks so much, Maggie.